So now we're moving to the kitchen. This is an absolutely beautiful kitchen with some amazing opportunities to teach one-point perspectives in composition. So this is the first time we're going to dig into 1 and 2-point perspectives, the difference, and when to choose each when you're on location. What's great about this kitchen is that not only would we have the opportunity to shoot it on its own, it is beautiful, but there's so much interesting stuff way behind it that we can also incorporate into the frame. This will allow us to show how the spaces are interconnected and how the architect designed the space to flow from one area to another. Kitchens are typically some of the most cluttered spaces in a home. So what I do is I clean off the countertops entirely. I start from almost scratch. I want it to be as clean and simple as possible. This will help you choose a composition, it'll make a stronger photograph, and it'll be much less distracting when you're done. So now the kitchen is clean, let's take a walk around and see what our options are. So from this corner right now, let's go ahead and take a shot, see how it looks. All right, so honestly, this is a pretty good angle, and I don't have too many problems with it. The one thing that I don't love about it is that we've got a great kitchen right here, but to the left, it's very empty and it's going to be very difficult to light. Another problem is that I really haven't photographed this fireplace or this staircase as well as I would have liked with that previous shot. I want to see if I can include it more and show how it fits into the home. So what I want to do is I'm going to come over here and I'll walk around. I know I'm too close for a 1-point perspective shot from over here. And if I come over here and take a shot from somewhere in this corner, I kind of like where it's heading. But again, I don't think our composition is as strong as it could possibly be. When I stand in this corner, I see all these strong leading lines. It's a very dynamic, angular design, and I really want to capture that. And standing in the corner kind of diminishes that. So let's see if we can come around here and line up a straight-on shot that's going to show some of these angles a bit better. And look at these, there's some wonderful shapes and leading lines that we get once we start to shoot straight on. If I come into this corner and shoot like this, what happens is I start to see all these wonderful dynamic leading lines, and I see everything that I want to in this photograph. I see the amazing staircase, the beautiful pass-through fireplace, the living room, and all these great lines which pull us into the frame. I think this is definitely the most interesting shot, and we can also clean it up quite a bit so that it reads very well to the camera. I like what I'm seeing. Now I'm going to kind of walk you through my thought process as I move around. So as I'm over here, I'll take a shot. As I come around and look through the viewfinder, there's certain things that I see that I definitely want to include in the frame. Things like, for example, this skylight, the pass-through fireplace, the window out there, the stairway. And I can move around, and as I come to the right, you can see that the composition stays pretty dynamic, but I'm losing a lot of those great features. And if I come here in the middle, I lose the skylight almost entirely, and things get pretty busy. And I really like seeing right down this pathway between the island and the sink. So I'm getting closer, I'm kind of dialing it in here. Let's see. Try to simplify this a little bit. Where can I go? I'll put on a 17, which theoretically and literally actually captures much more. But as you can see, everything in the background gets so diminished as to be almost inconsequential in the photograph. I like seeing more, but I don't like diminishing everything that's important. So we're going to keep the 24 on. I may even zoom in a little bit further or just crop. So it's something more like maybe a 26, 28, 30 millimeter focal length. All right, so it actually took me quite a while to find my exact composition. It really was a game of inches. With this finished composition now, I'm really happy with a lot of things about it. I like that you can see all the way into the living room. You can see the pass-through fireplace. You can see the stairwell all the way up. And you see all of these dynamic, really interesting lines in the kitchen. If we had stood in another corner, we would have lost a lot of that. So I'm really happy with where we are, and we're not that wide. We're at 24 millimeters, and I think in the end we're going to do a little bit of cropping. And all that being said, there's one thing that I don't like about this composition. And because we're using a 24 millimeter lens, we're picking up some of these cabinets on the left-hand side. But I'm using a 24 millimeter tilt shift. So what I can do is I can actually use the shift function and change the field of view while keeping the perspective that I love exactly the same. So I'm actually going to show you exactly how I fix that. I'm going to put my camera into video mode right now and show you how I'm going to shift to the right to solve my problems. So on the left-hand side of this frame, you can see these cabinets actually intruding right into the picture. And like I said, I love the perspective. I love everything about this shot except for that annoying cabinet. So rather than crop, I'm just going to use the shift function of this lens, and I'm going to roll it slightly to the right and open that up. And the benefit here is that we get to see some of these cabinets and woodwork on the right. So we've gone from this, which is straight ahead with no shift applied, slightly over to the right, which opens up the right-hand side of that frame and gets rid of the cabinet on the left. The perspective stays exactly the same, and the composition remains almost unchanged. We're just shifting the field of view to the right. So you may think it might just be easier to physically move the camera over, but that would introduce a whole bunch of other problems, and it's going to fundamentally alter the composition. If I were to just move the camera over, I would lose the entire inside of this island, including all the cabinets and the woodwork. I would put the oven vent right in front of the skylight, and I would lose the entire window to the fireplace. By leaving the camera here and shifting the lens, I retain that perfect perspective, and the composition remains almost entirely unchanged, but we deal with the problem of the cabinet intruding on the left-hand side. So before we finish off this picture and really start working at the lighting, there's a few more things that I want to fix. I want to declutter a little bit more, and I want to simplify. First thing that jumps out to me is these chair backs right on the island. There's not enough of them to actually tell what they are, so I'm just going to remove those chairs entirely. Second, behind the range hood and the lights here, we have a picture on the wall. This picture just really adds clutter. While in real life the picture looks great, when translated into a two-dimensional photograph, that whole area tends to get cluttered. So we're going to take the picture out and simplify. Same thing happens in the stairwell in the back. It's a great picture when you're here in real life walking through the space, but in the photograph it tends to add clutter, and again, we want to pull it out, simplify, make sure you can tell exactly what's going on in that stairwell. So at this point we have the composition dialed in, we're ready to shoot, let's get started. So a lot of people now would think, now is the time to light this up like crazy. I'm going to send flash pops everywhere, put an umbrella here, put a light bounced off the ceiling there, but we don't have to do that. This space kind of speaks for itself. It's light and bright, and I want to keep that mood. I don't want to overlight it. All we're going to do is subtract a little bit of light to clean it up instead of blasting this with tons of light. So as you can see, there's a gigantic window directly behind the camera. And if you look at this picture, you see the effect that that light is having on the frame overall. The light's coming and bouncing off the floor. There's a reflection in the range hood. We've got this orange light kind of casted over everything. It flattens out the scene. We lose a lot of dynamics. We're turning this window behind us into, it's almost like, it's acting like a big giant on-camera softbox, just flattening everything out. We have an extremely glorified party picture here, so we're going to knock that down, make sure the brightest part is in the end of the frame. It's going to pull the eye in and make us a much more dynamic photograph. So you might be wondering, how in the world am I going to control the light coming in through a 15-foot window? And in my camera bag, I have a lot of black cloth. You can call it duvetine, you can call it butterfly net, whatever. It comes in all kinds of varieties. We're just going to get that set up, and it's literally just going to block the light coming in that window. So we put some of this black cloth up behind me, and it's going to knock down the interior light levels behind me. It's going to take care of a lot of reflections and a lot of problem spots that were caused by that giant softbox of light coming in. So let's go ahead and take a shot and see what it did. So as you can see, guys, the main source of light is not coming from behind the camera, but rather in front of the camera. And that's going to add much more texture and depth to the camera instead of flattening everything out like the light from behind was doing. So now that we've added the cloth, you can see that we've gone from a very flat, dull light to a much more interesting light, which is going to bring out texture and depth in the photograph. So by moving our main light source away from the camera instead of behind the camera, we get a much more dynamic photograph with lots of texture and depth. If this were a different kitchen with a darker ceiling, darker finishings, I would of course want to come in and add some light, whether that was through individual flash pops or umbrellas or bouncing off the ceiling. But again, this is a light, bright, and airy home. I don't want to go heavy-handed on the lighting. So all we're going to do is subtractive lighting. I really don't think there's a lot more we need to work on in the lighting sense right now. This is looking really great. It's an accurate portrayal of the space. We have interesting light. We did a great job staging it. But there are a few things we could do to make it a little more interesting. It's kind of sterile. I kind of want to humanize this shot a little bit. So we're going to add some models and see what happens. We're going to use our assistant David. We're going to have him walk up and down the stairs, breathe some life into the shot. And then we're going to use the dog. His name is Boomer. We're going to see if we can get him to sit still for a minute. And we're going to composite both of them in. They're both going to add some life and motion to the shot. Keep in mind, guys, that because we're going to be going into Photoshop, we don't need to get this all right exactly in camera. We can shoot multiple exposures, and because the camera is on a tripod and not moving, it's going to be super easy to composite them together and make a much more interesting photograph. When you're shooting your models, or you're shooting whatever you want to composite into a frame, you want to pick a somewhat neutral exposure. So detail in the shadows, detail in the highlights, you want to make sure it's not too dark, not too bright. Right in the center of your brackets is going to be fine when you go to shoot your models. That way, you have a good starting point in Photoshop from which to bump up or bump down the exposure to get a seamless composite. The last thing that's bothering me is the light coming from the skylight. It's kind of a hot spot and the eye goes right to it. So what we're going to do is make use of what we have. We're just going to grab the blanket. Since everything else is done, we don't need it anymore. We're going to scrim that hot spot and then composite it in Photoshop. Again, all we need from that shot to block that light is just that little piece. So it's fine if the rest of the scene is a mess and your assistants are in the way. We're just going to take that little bit out. So the very last thing that we're going to do is bracket for the ambient exposures. Again, I want an even exposure. You can use your camera's meter to judge, and then you go 3 stops down and 3 stops up from that middle central base exposure. So in total, we're going to be compositing a handful of images here. We're going to have our base image, we're going to have our model coming down the stairs, we're going to have our dog Boomer on the rug, and we're going to have our scrim blocking out the hotspot on the couch. So I expect this will be 4, maybe 5 exposures if I decide some of it's a little bit too hot. But again, the most important thing was the composition, and we nailed it, so we're still going to have a great photograph without going nuts and overlighting it. So that being said, let's jump into Photoshop and put this thing together. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop about to begin processing our kitchen image. Now, as you saw on location, again, I didn't use any lights and there's not going to be any super complicated compositing here, but I do want to walk you through the shots that we took in Lightroom. I've kind of culled them already for you so you can get an idea of what we're starting and so that we keep it simple. As you can see in front of me here, I have my 5 bracketed exposures from a perfect even exposure, what the camera thinks is the best exposure, and what's actually a pretty good exposure considering the lighting situation, all the way up to 2 stops overexposed and again down to 2 stops underexposed. Now, similar to our last shot, I think we're only really going to need to use 1 base image because look at this histogram, guys. It's perfect. There's nothing that's extremely blown out, nothing that is completely lost in shadow, and the vast, vast majority of our information is centered right here in the middle of the histogram. So that's a great place to start. I've also got the image of the dog that we're going to use, the image of our model that we're going to use, and I've gone ahead and pulled out our scrimmed image where we're flagging off that light from the ceiling, and please excuse the video crew everywhere trying to get the shot for the video as well. So that is a grand total of what I estimate to be 4 images that we're going to need to pull this off. So as usual, I'm going to do some very simple adjustments in Lightroom. I'm going to pull down the highlights, pull up the shadows, and I think I'm going to leave everything else alone, but I'm going to apply those adjustments to all of the images. So it's just, again, to get the most data out of these files, I'm going to pull down the highlights, pull up the shadows, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command-Shift-S or Control-Shift-S on Windows. I'm going to click Check None here, and I'm just going to hit Highlights and Shadows, so that the highlight and shadow changes that I've made to that original file are synchronized, basically copy and pasted to all the files so that all the dynamic range and all the tones, all the values are the same in all 4 images. So I'm going to go ahead, hit synchronize, and we're going to go ahead and open these guys up in Photoshop. So right now is the time to navigate to the folder containing these images and get them ready to go to Photoshop. Alright, so here we are in Photoshop, and I'm going to show you how to open these JPEG files so that they stack automatically as layers in a single document. Something that we're going to do for every photo here. I'm going to go to File, Scripts, and then I'm going to go to Load Files into Stack right down here. I'm going to click on that. And what this is going to do is bring up this dialog box, and then from here I'm going to navigate to our 4 files in my Finder. I'm going to open those up. I'm going to browse, Kitchen, and I'm going to select all 4 of them. I'm going to hit Open. They're going to appear down here. I want to make sure that all of this is unchecked, and I'm going to hit OK. All right. Now, as you can see, our layers are aligned in alphabetical order from top to bottom. It should look just like mine. with the base on the bottom and then all the layers in ascending order all the way up to the top. I'm going to go ahead and hide all of these layers so that we're only working on our base layer. I'm going to hit F to make it full screen so we can work without distraction. And from here, we're going to start working on this file. As you saw on location, I really wanted to add a little bit of life, a little bit of movement to this photo. And what we did was we had our model, our assistant David, he stood in, and what he did was he went up and down the stairs. We tried to get a little of that blurred figure action in, just to give it a little bit of motion, a little bit of movement, to make the picture not feel so sterile. So when I turn that layer on, there we have David right there. And what I'm going to do, you can see that nothing over here has moved, because again, we're on a tripod, and it should be very simple for me to mask him out, and he will exactly match the scene that he's in. So what I'm going to do to mask him out is I'm going to create a new layer mask. I'm going to select the layer with David on it, which is number 3. I'm going to click this Add Layer Mask button. Now, what this allows me to do is this will allow me to hide and reveal certain parts of that layer. Now, what I want to do is I want to hide all of that layer and then selectively reveal where David is, and what is going to happen is that we should seamlessly place him in, and because the camera didn't move, we're not going to have to do any difficult compositing. It should be a very quick, simple couple of keystrokes to get that perfectly matched up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this mask right here with black. I'm going to select the paint bucket tool. The shortcut for that is G. It's also underneath the gradient tool over here. And I'm going to make sure that my foreground color is set to black. And I'm just going to fill this mask with black. You can click anywhere on the image, and that's going to hide David. And now to bring him back, to reveal him seamlessly into this image, I'm going to select the brush tool, or B is the shortcut for that. I'm going to make sure my foreground color is set to white, and I'm going to change the size of my brush so it's a little bit bigger. I'm going to go up to maybe, we'll try, how about 500 pixels, and I want to make sure that it's nice and soft, so I'm going to bring the hardness all the way down. Now, another way to adjust the size and hardness is using the brackets. I can use the right bracket to get bigger and the left bracket to go smaller, and I can hold Shift with the brackets to make the brush harder and softer. And so what I want is a big soft brush with my foreground color set to white, and I just want to paint over this hidden area to start revealing our model. And there it is. There's no complicated pen tooling, there's no complicated cutting and pasting, it's just a soft brush set to reveal on our mask, which is going to bring our figure back in. Now the next thing is very similar. I really like the idea of having this dog on the floor. Again, it gave some life, it gave some motion to this photograph. It told somewhat a believable story. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the second layer named Dog right here. And again, because we're on a tripod, nothing really moved. Everything should line up perfectly. But instead of adding a mask and then filling it with black, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Alt and click on this Add Layer Mask button. And that's going to automatically fill the layer with black rather than having to go get the paint bucket and dump and fill it in. Again, I'm going to hold Alt and hit this Add Layer Mask button, and as you can see, the mask that we add to that layer is filled with black. I still have my brush tool selected and the foreground color set to white. Again, I want this to be a soft brush. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and I'm going to start painting in the dog. Now the problem that immediately becomes apparent is that we see Lee's feet show up with such a big brush. So I'm going to make the brush smaller. I'm going to left bracket, and I'm going to switch the foreground color to black. Now that the foreground color is set to black, that's going to hide that mask. That's going to hide the areas that I paint black. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paint over his feet and make sure that nothing else of Lee's, or anyone else for that matter, shows up. So all I'm doing is painting around the dog. And if you want to see exactly where you're masking, you can hit the backslash key while you have the mask selected. And that will show you exactly what you are revealing and hiding. Now obviously red is hidden and clear or white is revealing, and you can see exactly what you're doing. So if I go too far and I start to see Lee's feet again, I don't have to just guess. I can actually use this red mask to see exactly what I'm masking. And in this case, all I want to do is mask the dog, so I'm just going to keep it right around him. All right, I can again hit backslash and turn that off, and now we're back in business. Now this image is starting to look pretty good. There's a bit of life in it, it's starting to come together. So what I want to do now is I want to take care of this sort of distracting overhead hotspot down here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on our last layer called scrim, and that's where we blocked that nuclear hotspot of light. So, and the concept here is extremely similar to the other masking that we did. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to alt-click, add layer mask. It's going to add a mask filled with black. And I'm going to zoom in here, and using my brush set to white, I'm just going to paint over that kind of troubling hotspot, and I want to just give it a nice kind of wide, soft brush so that it seamlessly blends. If I tried to do this with, say, a hard, small brush, I'd have a much more difficult time of it, because as you can see, it's a very hard edge and things don't blend together seamlessly. So again, make sure your softness using Shift left bracket or the brush toolbar up here, make sure your hardness or softness is maximized. Remove all your hardness all the way to the left. Make your brush medium size, I'd say, foreground color set to white, and just gently paint in where we scrimmed out that hotspot. And again, you can be nice and gentle with it so that it seamlessly blends together. All right, things are looking really good here, but there's a few more things I want to do to kick this up, take it to the next level, make sure everything's perfect. Like the last image, there are a few things I want to clone out and clean up. Whenever I'm shooting architecture, like I said, I take out not only little blemishes and outlets and light switches, but I also take out things like vents, sometimes speakers, anything that wasn't necessarily dictated or put there by the architect, but might have been built in by a contractor or something else. And generally, taking this stuff out really helps to clean up and simplify the image. What I want to do is I want to remove these vents. Now, these look like they're really tricky to clone. As you can see, there's a really kind of tough gradient in here, and I'm not going to be able to just use a clone stamp tool and kind of patch this back together. I'll show you what happens. For example, if I try to clone this, what's going to happen is if I can sample, so I've got my clone tool selected, I'm going to rename this clone. If I have my clone stamp tool and I start sampling some of this, what's going to happen is that perfect gradient of light on the ceiling isn't going to match up, and you're going to get this kind of splotchy, imperfect look. And then the other problem is what happens when I get to this wire. It's going to be really, really difficult to clone around that. Now, I don't care how good you are at cloning, just using the clone stamp tool isn't enough to get you a good result. You cannot deliver a file like this. It's kind of a mess. So what we're going to do, we're going to delete that layer, and I'm going to show you a really quick, simple trick that'll help you remove objects on walls, objects in light, in gradients, and it doesn't work only in architecture, but a lot of other applications as well. So make a new layer. You can hit this new layer button right here, and that's going to give us layer 1. I'm going to double click. I'm going to rename that clone. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the polygonal lasso, which we touched on briefly in the Intro to Photoshop tool. So I want you to hit L, or I want you to click and hold and select the polygonal lasso tool up here on the left. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a very wide selection all the way around this ceiling, all around the vent. Go right up along the edge of that wire, and then I want you to do the same thing on the left-hand side, but in order to add to this selection, I want you to hold Shift. You're going to get that little plus symbol. So hold Shift and make another lasso selection, being sure to be nice and wide and generous with this all the way around, and close that. And what this is going to do, this is going to constrain our little cloning operation just within these dotted marching ants. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit G, but I'm not going to use the paint bucket tool. I'm actually going to use the gradient tool. So if you come in over here on the left-hand side and your paint bucket tool is selected, just be sure to hit the gradient tool. It's under the same shortcut. And as we've done earlier, we've kind of sampled some colors for our curves. I want to sample the two colors of this gradient of it's almost like a greenish red down here to a light gray red pastel up here. So I want to sample the top, and I'm going to switch my foreground and background colors, and I want to sample the bottom. And the way I'm sampling is I'm just holding Alt, and if you hold Alt with a gradient or paint bucket or a brush, it will let you sample a color, and that color will immediately show up in your colors palette down here. So Alt-click to sample, and then switch your foreground and background colors, and sample the other edge of the gradient. And now what you're going to do is, on this layer, I want you to drag that gradient straight down to match the gradient of light on the ceiling. It's going to look something like that. And you can perfect it a little bit. That's looking a little bit better, I think. All right, and now we can deselect our marching ants. I'm going to hit Command D or Control D on Windows. And this is obviously pretty rough and dirty. We're going to refine this a lot. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. In order to help this blend seamlessly together, I usually add about 1.5% of noise when I'm using this trick. And as you can see, we go from that perfectly smooth gradient to something that looks like a photograph, right? It actually matches the color and texture behind it. We're going to click OK. And now what we're going to do is we're going to add a mask. Again, I'm going to click Add Layer Mask. I'm not going to hold Alt, just a regular white layer mask. And I'm going to select my brush tool. And I'm going to set my foreground color to black to hide, so I can hide some of this excessive gradient here. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And again, using a big soft brush, I'm just going to start to kind of paint out some of that excessive gradient. All I want is the area above that vent. Be sure you don't get any of that edge while you're doing this. All right, and now that's looking pretty good. So I think this is a little bit bright overall, so I want to kind of darken this area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click back on the layer. I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Exposure. And I'm just going to kind of darken it just a smidge so that it matches the exposure of the ceiling around it. And I'm going to click OK once I have that done. As you can see, that does a much better job than trying to clone it. It's not perfect yet, so I'm going to zoom in, and I'm just going to kind of use that brush to kind of refine it a little bit and make it a little bit better and more seamless. All right, that's looking much better. The color's not perfect. I would probably go in and refine this if it was going to go in my portfolio, but it gets the point across. Now, the next thing I want to do is the same thing. I'll do it again, just so you guys can understand the concept. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to name this, let's say, Vent Near Stairs. And I'm going to drag out my lasso, just nice and wide around the object. And I'm going to select my gradient tool, G for gradient. And what I'm going to do is, just as before, I'm going to sample on the top of that gradient, and again on the bottom of that gradient, and I'm going to drag that over and get it to match as close as I can to the actual gradient on the wall. Once I've got that done, I'm going to hit Command D or Control D to deselect, and I'm going to go to Filter, Add Noise. Photoshop keeps your last used filter at the top, just to kind of seamlessly give it the same noise properties and characteristics as the actual photo. I'm going to add a layer mask, not filled with black, just regular white, and I'm going to select my brush with B, switch my foreground and background colors, and gently just kind of paint out the hard edge of that gradient. And as you can see, I'll zoom out a little bit. That was really simple and basically a perfect removal of that vent. So now things are looking pretty good here. As I zoom around this image, I've noticed that in the reflection of this glass are some video tripods and lights, it looks like. Because it was such a small space, this was bound to happen. There's about 5 cameras at any one time rolling. So I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to rename this fireplace cloning. And I'm going to zoom in, and using a very similar technique, I'm going to grab the lasso and kind of piece by piece here, I'm going to lasso each section of this fireplace reflection, and I'm going to either clone or paint out what I don't need. So I'm going to try the clone tool. So I'm going to try the clone tool first. The shortcut for that is S. I'm going to Alt-click to sample, and I'm just going to kind of remove those tripod legs in that reflection. And again, I'm using a soft brush to kind of cover my tracks and keep it simple. I'll do the same thing over this carpet here. Again, just going piece by piece, keeping everything constrained to where it belongs. Making sure that all those textures line up. All right, and lastly, just this little area here. All right, so we've gone ahead and removed that. I'm going to clean that up slightly. Again, don't need to get this perfect. I just want you guys to get the point. Now that all my cloning is all set, and I think everything is almost ready to go, I want to do a little bit of color correction because I know these are a little bit wonky colors. It looks a little bit too warm for me. And just like the last image, I'm going to do a really quick and simple fix to get these much better, crisper colors that I want. I'm going to add a new adjustment layer. I'm going to go down to curves. And just like last time on the first image, I'm going to set my white point, my black point, and my gray point. So my white point, I'm going to go ahead and the brightest white up here, and my gray point, I'm going to go on this wall. That's looking like a good gray to me. And again, my black point, I'm going to Alt-click, and it looks like this little crevice. And if I turn that layer on and off, it becomes a much crisper, whiter, snappier image. Now, I do think this image still needs a little bit of contrast, so I'm going to add another curves layer. And this time, I'm just going to use one of the default curve settings. I'm going to actually go to a preset here, and I'm going to try a linear contrast. And that's looking pretty good. It just gets rid of a little bit of that haze, kind of cleans up and sharpens up the image, and I really like where this is going. We've got some nice crisp whites, and everything is looking really good. We've got a nice histogram from dark to white, and I think on the whole, I'm really happy with this picture. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, again, as always, make sure my verticals are straight. I'm going to go Command-Alt-Shift-E and flatten everything to a new layer. And with my rulers, I'm going to drag down some lines, and because this is a one-point perspective, not only do the vertical lines have to be straight, but the horizontal lines also have to be straight. So I'm going to drag these down to a horizontal plane right here on the edge of the island, and I'll drag some over onto the vertical planes as well. One on the cabinet there, one on the edge of the fireplace, and one all the way over to the right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command-T for transform, right-click, and skew. You can also go to Edit Transform to get here. And I'm just going to zoom in. And as you can see, this vertical line is a little bit off. It feels like it's leaning a little bit. So I'm going to drag out this handle and get that vertical wall nice and straight. Looks like it needs a little bit more. And as I pull that to the right, it looks like I'm pulling the image a little too far, so I'm going to pull this corner out too. Make sure that everything stays nice and vertical. That's looking good. How does this look? Maybe went a little too far on it. Something like that. All right, that's looking pretty good. A little tweak up there. And these horizontal lines, that looks nice and straight. All right, that's looking good. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Enter and commit those changes. And one thing I want you to note when shooting kitchens is that refrigerators are never really vertical. They're always built with a little bit of lean in them so that the doors shut automatically on their own, and that so if anything melts, it doesn't leak out of the refrigerator. So don't ever use the refrigerator as a vertical line when you're checking your verticals. So as you can see, if I drag this ruler over, that refrigerator is not vertical, and that is totally normal. So everything is done here. I'm going to go ahead and save this image. I'm going to save this as a TIFF. We'll go ahead and save it back to the desktop, and you can either bring this back into Lightroom to finish it off or save it into your finished folder with the rest of the files. All right, so for this kitchen shot, like I said, we had a very simple lighting situation. We had nice white ceilings, white walls. It was pretty much lit for us, but it was great in that we got a nice taste of compositing and adding a bit of life and motion to our photographs. I really like the composition. It was pretty tricky to find, but I'm glad that we dug a little bit and found it. I really like how everything in this image looks. With all that being said, let's go back on location, head upstairs, and start working on our bathroom shot.